People of color always hit institutional walls. Those institutional walls have been built for people of color to be confined. But they've been built so that people who are white don't really experience them. Scientific racism is old, right? Scientific racism is the belief that empirical evidence exists to support and justify racism. And it's used really to prove that people are inferior or to prove that there's racial superiority. By that point, I understood how transparency and inclusion and equity really helped propel a company and an organization forward, right? You come up with better products, you have better collaboration. People actually are on their best behavior when they're working together, right? They remember things. Studies have shown that people remember more when they work with diverse communities because they learn more.
Pierette, thanks for coming onto the show. You are a certified ethnobotanist and a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Throughout your body of work, you've run marketing departments for nonprofits. You served as a Wall Street Analyst specializing in data trend, and branding analysis. And recently, you presented at the State Department sponsored conference, One Health. In other words, you have a very deep understanding of how diversity, equity, and inclusion can greatly impact the success of an organization, a university, a school, a community, or even a brand. I'm so honored to have you on the show, and I'm excited to chat about how bias manifests in our technology, your take on the current discussion surrounding critical race theory, and also the evolution of eugenics. But before we jump into these topics, I want to give our audience a chance to get to know you. So my first question has two parts. On one hand, I'm curious to know, what are the moments or series of moments in your life that inspired you to pursue this work? And on the other hand, how has the work and the industry changed you?
Oh, wow. Those are great questions. Thank you for asking them. And thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I've been following you on social media. And so it's really exciting to be able to actually talk to you face to face, not just, commenting.
I'm glad you're here.
So I guess first, you had asked like a little bit about me and my journey here, and I am African American. I identify as African American. My parents are African American. My grandparents were African American. But at that level, the grandparent level, there's some mixture. That's where the mixture comes in. There was Irish and Italian. Some people immigrated here from Ireland and Italy, and my other grandfather was half Scotticook, which is Native American from Connecticut. And so my background was always interesting, right? They actually were together before there was even a law allowing them to be together, right? So because, it just wasn't until the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act and Loving happened, people weren't even allowed to be interracially married, right? So it's always been an interesting experience, but I grew up in a tiny town north of New York City. So small, it's called a hamlet. And it's called Bedford Hills. And we were one of the few Black families. So everyone knew what I was growing up. And then when I left for college, for Bryn Mawr College, that's when I started having to really kind of explain my background. But I should say, even though we were one of the few Black families and everyone knew what I was, it was still really challenging, right? That has its challenges, being the only Black family in a town. Mm-hmm. And I was really lucky that I had extended family. Anyway, long story short, I went to Bryn Mawr. I did a domestic exchange at Spelman. And then I went on to study at University of Alaska, Fairbanks, where I studied ethnobotany, and also at Villanova, where I did a master's in public administration. So I've kind of, over time, had this culmination of work that came together. I landed on Wall Street, which is like very interesting. I landed on Wall Street because I had been working in television, actually. And I didn't want to work in television anymore because the rules for what you could pitch, I was an associate producer, and the rules for the stories I could pitch were so limiting. And they were limiting often by race, right? If it bleeds, it leads belonged to a certain race. Human interest stories really were only given to white folks. Native Americans weren't allowed to be covered because they talked too slow. Then other cultures weren't allowed to be covered because of the accents. Now that's changed, right? That's changed over time, but at that time it was very limiting. And so I left and I wanted to go into film. And so I attempted and I landed on the trading floor.
Whoa.
I know. And anyway, long story short, I landed in, I then kind of navigated until I got to socially responsible investing. And when I worked in socially responsible investing, I was working as a marketing and a data and trend analysis analyst. And then from there, I worked there for 10 years. I really enjoyed what I did, but things started to change, the market started to change, and the products I was covering started to change. And so I went into human services instead. And that was literally 6 months before Wall Street crashed and all that drama happened. Yeah.
Wow.
I know. It was following your bliss works sometimes. And so I ran marketing departments for nonprofits. And, by that point, I understood how transparency and inclusion and equity really helped propel a company and an organization forward, right? You come up with better products, you have better collaboration. People actually are on their best behavior when they're working together, right? They remember things. Studies have shown that people remember more when they work with diverse communities because they learn more. And so what we started doing was we started making sure that we had equitable platforms and policies and procedures to bring in the voices of clients and the voices of people who were working there at all different levels. And that was life-changing, I have to say. And I did that for about 10 years, and then I went back to school, and now here I am.
Wow.
Doing this. Yeah. And so I think, you also asked how working in this position has changed me.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, in many ways, it's been empowering. Most people don't get to talk about who they are and bring their authentic self to work every day, right? At the same time, I don't escape the same discrimination that I'm trying to teach people not to do, right? And so I have to figure out self-care in dealing with that. But I also have to figure out how to navigate working with clients, working with colleagues, and working within the system that everyone's been conditioned within, right? So that's been a whole unique set of challenges. And it's something that I think we all struggle with, but it's something that's incredibly rewarding. It's also been interesting to see kind of how there are ebbs and flows to how people really want this work, right? So I started in 2019, I started doing this work. And I did a lot of research to find out who would be possible clients, tried reaching out to people, was very lucky in that, was already part of communities, nonprofit communities that were interested in this work. But then when George Floyd, when George Floyd happened and kind of the whole world was watching because of the pandemic, all of a sudden there was this spark, right? We all know this, but that also meant that there was a rise in people wanting to know more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And more specifically, there was like a slight shift, right? It wasn't just about diversity anymore. It wasn't just about hiring people anymore, right? Now there was a concern about equity and sustainability and retention. And that's important, right? And likewise, all of a sudden we had people at very high levels of government and for-profit companies talking about how this also affected how the pandemic was going to be dealt with, right? How medical industries had worked and operated, how political systems were going to kind of affect who was going to, experience COVID because of essential workers, right? There were a whole host of things that all of a sudden people are home and they're not commuting and they're not bringing their kids to soccer and they're actually watching the news and they're on social media and they're getting hit fast and furiously with all of this information that other folks knew existed, other folks experienced, but maybe they didn't see, right? Because people of color always hit institutional walls. Those institutional walls have been built for people of color to be confined, but they've been built so that people who are white don't really experience them. And so it's been part of our work to kind of show where those walls exist for the people who don't see it, and also to ask the folks who are experiencing it what walls they feel need to come down. And then trying to see how we can connect folks and have action, right? Because it's all about the outcomes, and those outcomes are always going to grow, right? It's always going to be a growth process.
Wow.
I rambled. I'm
No,
sorry.
no. I'm glad that you really touched base on this, because I think it's really fascinating, that journey of going, landing on Wall Street and then doing this work and really having an understanding of not just how diversity, equity, inclusion are related to one particular company, but how it connects to the overall health of that organization and just the people, and how it reverberates into the communities themselves. And so on that subject of diversity, equity, inclusion, I want to actually talk about a core concept, which is bias. Usually when we speak about bias at work, we tend to think about, a racist hiring manager, or a misogynist coworker. But I want us to focus specifically on the biases within things we automatically assume are neutral. Things like science, things like data, things like technology. Here on LLAG Radio, we've talked about biases within hiring and recruiting software, and the way that racial biases can creep into these so-called neutral algorithms. But I also know that bias within recruiting and hiring is just the tip of that iceberg. As somebody who's worked in DEI so extensively, what can you tell us about bias within technology that we consider neutral?
So that's a tough one, right? Because bias bias is in everything. It's baked into everything, right? So there really isn't such a thing as neutral, right? Everyone comes from a place where they were raised, where they were brought up culturally, where they have different ideas of things. And really colonization has reached every corner of this earth, right? So whether you're a colonizer or you've kind of indoctrinated folks with the colonization, it's really hit every corner of this earth, right? And so therefore, it means when we make those things within those constructs, right? We make those things within those frameworks. And so, there's this saying, well, this is an old saying, right? When I worked on Wall Street, and we would be sitting there for hours in our little bullpen cubicle, right? Just kind of inputting data and analyzing it. And if you were tired, right, someone would say like, hey, take a break, because the data is only as good as the person who puts it in. Right? So if you mess up the data, you've messed up the project basically, and you've let your whole team down. But that goes further, right? Like that goes to everything. So if we're talking about science, well, science is based on data, right? The scientific method is literally collecting data. And so, you have to look at things like who is inputting that data, who sponsored that data, right? Like where did that data come from? Who had the idea? Who questioned it? Who's paying for that study? Who's paying for those resources? What are they trying to get out of it, right? Because that's probably, whether or not it's intended, that's probably going to color the data that's inputted, right? So these are all things that we kind of have to think about, and we don't always think about it. As a matter of fact, we rarely think about it. We always think science is objective. We always think data is objective. And even in our DEI work, right? Some folks are just completely data driven. And I get that. But at the same time, even if you try to account for bias in that data, there's just no way. It's always going to be biased. And so you kind of have to balance it out with anecdotal things. You have to balance it out with real life experiences. You can't just rely on this data. And, there's this, I actually looked for this last night before, going to bed, because I knew I would be on the show. There was this post that you put up that I remembered, and it was by Dr. Augusta Etinuke Irel. And it said, none of the Google devices in my house understand my mom's Nigerian accent. But please keep lecturing me on how math, science, and tech are neutral, quote unquote, and have no bias, quote unquote. And I thought, that's so spot on, right? That's so spot on. But it's not all lost, right? I mean, we do have things that we can put in place. We do have ways that we can look at this, right? Once the data's in there, we have humans that actually can look it over, that can actually collaborate on what they're putting out there, that can do focus groups and get more feedback, right? That can include more communities. And I think that's really the key here. A lot of groups are waking up to this. I am biased because I studied ethnobotany, right? Which is the place where culture and botany come together. Right. And so it's really looking at botany through different cultural lenses, predominantly indigenous lenses from different parts of the world. And so the idea that we can only use this very scientific based method, once we start looking at different methods, right, we can actually open it up. And I think we're at that point where there's a desire for that, right? We're at that point where even things like 15 years ago, if you said to your doctor, I want to go for acupuncture or I want to use aromatherapy, there was no way that was possible, right? But now we're at a point where that's actually considered valid methodologies that you can actually use, right? So I think we're at a good place. But I think it's always a process, right? It's always about growth, and it's always about seeing where there's bias and trying to see where there's bias and uncover it as you move along.
Yeah, and I like what you're talking about when it comes to the fact that data is just is the starting point. You have to be able to interpret it. You have to be able to figure out what you're going to do with that data and what elements you're going to focus on. And one of the unique advantages of your work in DEI from such a high level are the trends that you've been able to observe within this work, and also surrounding even just public conversations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're now in December 2021, and it honestly feels like a lifetime ago when the main concern for Republicans was affirmative action, because, today the current discourse is dominated by critical race theory, CRT. And, I'm curious, like, from your vantage point, what is your diagnosis of the critical race theory movement? Did you anticipate this thing happening a few years ago? Did it seem like it was sort of on the rise? What's your take?
So those are great questions, by the way. And I should disclose that I am a Kimberly Crenshaw fangirl, and Kimberly Crenshaw is one of the people who is credited with founding critical race theory. And, to be clear, critical race theory is something that's taught in law school. Even if it's taught, I took sociology and anthropology, and, I took it at Spelman and at Bryn Mawr. And, both of those places studied Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and folks, but that still wasn't critical race theory. Right? Like, we read some of their ideas and some of their thoughts, some of their books, but we weren't learning it from a law perspective. And so I feel like that needs to be named, because, if you get into the argument about semantics and the fact that they're pushing this false narrative, you're already kind of losing. I think really to even have the argument over critical race theory is kind of a losing argument in a lot of ways. And yet I completely get pulled into it.
100%. I know it's bait, but
yeah, I totally get baited. But and that's because it really hits a chord for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. We know that, in terms of oppression, and if you don't mind just kind of like letting me just kind of read off like a little list of things I have, like in terms of oppression, one of the number one things that was done to folks, and this is why it's such a hot button topic, right, was, of course, they stole land from folks, they oppressed folks, and of course they brought people over and they enslaved them. And then of course there were the internment camps, which are kind of still happening today in Texas. And so there's this history, right? It is child separation 101. And then once it's child separation, right, this is like race 101, right? Child separation. And then once you have child separation, you have these policies that stop them from having their traditional haircuts, their traditional clothes. They can't speak their language. They can't practice their religion. They can't share their knowledge. They can't use their medicine, right? And this is back to science, right? They can't use their medicine. Their bodies are no longer theirs. And so they don't have autonomy and control over even their bodies. And so, this hits a topic for folks who, have experienced colonization or oppression in multiple ways. And this also like kind of calls on the genetic traumatization that a lot of folks have right now. At the same time, we know what's happening, right? This is the whitewashing. This is just another name for the traditional whitewashing that I just talked about, right? And so it's nothing new. It has a new name. They latched onto it. I don't even understand the Marxism that they're talking about.
Oh gosh.
I mean, it's like they're
what?
kind of making up all these falsehoods so that they can really scare people, right? That's the thing. They're taking out their bullhorn and they're just trying to use what they know works, which is fear and division. And it is kind of working. There are lots of folks that don't want to be seen as bad, right? They don't want their families to be seen as bad. They don't want to feel guilty for something that they feel they didn't do. And the truth of the matter is we were all born into the system, right? So even if they didn't do it, they're in the system. And now we just kind of have to clean it up. And so that's pretty much where we are. It's this bullhorn, it's a dog whistle, it's whatever you want to call it. It works because it's historical and it's also current, right? This is the thing. We're always saying, well, the history, and we do need to talk about the history. And this is what it's trying to erase. They know how powerful this history is. And they know how powerful it is for people to understand this history. And they know how powerful it was for everyone to be working remote and having time to see it, right? Everyone's getting pushed back into their offices. It's almost as if last year was a fever dream. Like it didn't even happen. So I think it's something that I'm hoping will lose its momentum. I'm hoping that if we just kind of keep talking about the need to communicate and be transparent, and how to work that into curriculums, we do need to work it into curriculums. It has to be part of school for children. It has to be part of college. It has to be part of, honestly, our work environments as well. Real estate, people who work in real estate, they need to know about redlining, right? People who work in medicine, they need to understand that there were alternative medicines that people were not allowed to use, even during the Anthropocene, which was like yesteryear's pandemic, right? So there are and there was a lot of technology lost, right? And so I think, kind of understanding that background, but also understanding that we can't give any more air to it. Now, having said that, I am worried because one of the things that came out of that was that memorandum that the last administration put out saying that these things couldn't be discussed and federally funded. Like if anyone discussed them, funding was pulled. And that affected me, right? That affected me as a DEI consultant. But that affected me more as a mom and as an aunt. I'm very concerned about future generations and they're not understanding things. I mean, the stats that came out on people who thought the Holocaust was fake was shocking, right? So we clearly need to keep talking about these things because not everyone has the experience of having a great uncle who fought in World War II, right? Or who experienced the internment camps. And not everyone has the experience of having a grandmother that worked in the factories, while everyone else was away. So it does have to keep, the conversation going.
Yeah, I mean, you bringing up the fact that, sometimes even just having the conversation is already a losing game. It hits me in the feels because I talk about it, but it's one of those difficult things where it's like someone threw trash on your lawn, and yeah, you didn't put the trash there, but someone's gonna have to get it, and it's you're going to have to sort of clean it up. You're going to have to sort of discuss it, especially since it's so impactful and it's having this effect, and staying within this universe of DEI, but shifting lanes just a little bit. I actually want to move on to the subject of One Health, which is a concept that describes the deeply intertwined relationship between humans, animals, and the environment, and the way they all impact each other. Your argument is that science is an area where this idea that humans, animals, and environments are interconnected is severely lacking. So my question is, why is this an especially big problem within the sciences, and what is at stake if we don't fix this problem?
Yeah, and what I would say is, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's severely lacking. I think it's kind of new, right? It's a relatively new idea that I actually fully embrace. I love the fact that there's this One Health idea, right? Because all of a sudden now we're talking about animals as sentient beings, which science, right, didn't recognize animals as sentient beings for a long time. We're talking about the environment and ecosystems and making sure those ecosystems stay healthy. I mean, my gosh, that's so relevant right now. We need this so badly. And what One Health does is, what I should say is ideally, One Health is going to bring in lots of indigenous communities from around the world, right? Every continent has a different indigenous community, and they'll be bringing them in from around the world, as well as bringing in folks who are scientifically trained, classically trained. And so it's this idea of having this kind of multidisciplined, collaborative, multi-sectorial, right? Because the sectors are a very real piece to One Health and to medicine in general, right? And so having this kind of, multifaceted approach really provides us to move forward on global levels and include groups that haven't been included. I think my concern is that without really there being very mindful and intentional policies in place and practices in place, and those will always change. The great thing about science is there's a growth mindset, right? And so you have to constantly question and keep moving science forward. But I think, kind of really bringing in these groups and bringing in these cultures that have been so involved in maintaining and keeping ecosystems and fighting for the environment and for their homes and fighting for environmental justice. They really have to be in the room where it happens, right? They have to be in that room. And I think that is kind of where I was saying, I don't think it's bad, but it's and when it started with that intention. However, now that it's getting to these higher levels, there needs to be some sort of process to ensure that it continues these practices.
And I actually want to dig just a little bit more into this, because another thing that you had mentioned on this topic was that science has also failed when it comes to, historically speaking, when it comes to the accommodations of humans, animals, and the environment. And the name that you have on your list of people who have sort of failed in this area is the first recorded ethnobotanist and the author of many books on taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus. Earlier in 2021, I wrote a post about Carl Linnaeus on a series called Blood Lies about scientific racism. And he talked about the significance of Carl's contributions to race when he published, this conspiracy theory where he proposed that humans of different races were entirely different species that he categorized and ranked under the 5 varieties. I wrote that post in 2021. Carl published his work on the 5 varieties in 1767. So over 250 years have passed, and people from around the world still believe in Carl's theory that racial inferiority is a biological fact.
Right.
But my post only covered, again, one speck of Carl's legacy. As an ethnobotanist yourself, what are your thoughts on the impact of Carl Linnaeus, and what sort of aspects of his work come to mind?
So, it's amazing, right? Because Carl Linnaeus is literally the baseboard of everything scientifically categorized, right? This is the common language that we use all around the world. One of the things in ethnobotany is trying to understand when the first things you do is when you go to an area, you learn the language. And you don't only use the classifications of Carl Linnaeus. And this is because when you learn the language, there's so many more nuances, right? There's so many more structures, right? You might have subsistence living versus living off of a capitalistic economy, right? And subsistence living would be when people hunt for their food and they maintain a sustainable ecosystem, right? But that would be indigenous folks, right? And they were pretty low on Carl Linnaeus's list, right, of hierarchy, even though their technology was advanced and was incredible, right? And so Carl Linnaeus poses this like complicated and yet kind of simplistic problem, right? Where literally everything around the world and all the scientific methods and the scientific categorizations that we use are from him. And because of this, we can actually communicate with each other. And that's a benefit. That's good. But it also means that we've lost so much, right? We've lost so much that actually probably could have helped us and helped others, and still can in so many ways. And it's also complicated, right? Because it feeds into, like you said, he had the 5 varieties, right, of humans.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, like he didn't know how to categorize it exactly, but he called us varieties, right? We were 5 varieties. And, this really kind of led to this concept of scientific racism. And scientific racism is old, right? Scientific racism is the belief that empirical evidence exists to support and justify racism. And it's used really to prove that people are inferior or to prove that there's racial superiority. You had mentioned eugenics and the evolution of eugenics, which was rooted in social Darwinism, right? And it was the idea that notions of fitness and competition and inequality were like really were really important, and this was the survival of the fittest, and that's why certain groups dominated other groups, right? And this was born out of these classifications. And even today we have our census that uses these classifications, right? And when you look at it, you can see the economic impact of these classifications just by looking at the census. And the census is used. It's very important that people do fill it out because it is used to distribute resources, right? And hopefully that's how we get back to equity and equality, depending on which administration is in place, really. But it's all very important stuff, and it's all very complicated, and it's all historical. And there are some things I had mentioned also that people of color are very much aware of this, but other folks aren't, right? And people of color, even in our lifetime, right, might have known someone who was part of the Tuskegee experiment, where Black men were given an STD and unwittingly, and the consequences of that for them and their families. People might know about Henrietta Lacks, who her DNA has been used for multiple experiments, even though her family has kind of fought against that. And then you have things like even recently in our lifetime, right? You have the AIDS epidemic and some things that unfolded in terms of how people dealt with that, how different public health, platforms dealt with AIDS and how it really exploded in certain communities. And, the Black community has really suffered a lot under all of these things. But not only the Black community, right? We see also how the policies of, we mentioned essential workers before, and how that has really kind of like fed into how people have survived or not survived COVID, right? And the numbers right now, or at least as of the summer, the Black community, the death rate was twice that of the white community. The Latinx and Indigenous communities were 1.5. And the Asian community actually did fairly well. But I don't think that was because of policy. I think there are also some other things that kind of came into play with that. So it's really difficult. I realize I brought us back to kind of like why there's skepticism. But, to go back to your idea of Carl Linnaeus, he's just so deeply baked into our system, right? That like even my daughter in like second grade, when she was learning biology, learned his terminology, right? And so it starts really young. We're really kind of given this information really young, and it continues throughout our entire lives as we continue to do things like the census and watch the news.
Wow. Yeah. And, you talking about just the way we, at a very early age, already just normalize him as this is the truth. This is just how we communicate. And on that subject, for our last question of the day, I actually wanted to open this discussion a little bit broader and focus on what you were talking about earlier, which is eugenics. Which is, again, the practice of breeding out people with inferior genetics while you uplift and try to support those who have what you believe to be superior genetics. Unfortunately, like Carl Linnaeus, capitalism and white supremacy, eugenics has also stood the test of time. Even though the eugenics conferences and organizations that sprang up in the early 1900s are no longer active, that doesn't necessarily mean that eugenics isn't being implemented today. And you were sort of talking a little bit about that, especially when it came to coronavirus. But nowadays, again, eugenics can be seen everywhere, from our environment and how we deal with public health to technology. But it's also done or it can be done in a very discreet way, where a lot of people don't recognize at first that, oh, this is in line with eugenics. As a specialist in this field, where else do you see eugenics manifesting? And how can regular folks like myself or our audience members be more aware, or maybe even to take action?
So this is a tough one and a controversial one. But, there have been discussions that eugenics exists today in terms of genetic testing, right? That's one of the ways, because genetic testing, right, it's not really that we all have different DNAs. This is why we couldn't be separated as different species, right? We're the same species and we have the same DNA. But a lot of the DNA testing, right? Even if you take a test with one company versus another, you'll get different results. And the reason for that is because, there are lots of reasons for that. But one of the main reasons goes back to the data input, right? And the data collected. And so one of the main ways that these companies are going around, and they are mostly private companies at this point, are going around and gathering data in an unregulated way, is that, or I shouldn't say, some parts of it are unregulated. And so they go to different areas and they see, and this makes sense, right? They see what's common, right? What are the common traits to this country? What are the common traits to that country, right? Because genetics aren't drawn by country lines, right? Those are made by the countries, not by our DNA. And so to be able to say that people have this certain DNA, it's because they went and they gathered certain traits. But how are they choosing those traits? What are they looking for, right? There are all sorts of questions that go into that further. And then things like Indigenous folks here, right? There are lots of folks and lots of Indigenous tribes that, were redrawn in the 1700s and the 1800s. Their names were completely changed. There was genocide, right? So how are they going to get that DNA? So, there are lots of folks that have this family knowledge of being Indigenous, but they can't really talk to that. They can't see that on the DNA. That's more complicated because there's also blood quantum with being Indigenous. And actually, maybe this is like, kind of a little bit of an offshoot to your question, right? Blood quantum is how Native you are, right? And so the idea is, and for African Americans, it used to be one drop of blood. So there was blood quantum for Native Americans, and the more Native American you were, the more rights you had to your land. The less Native you became, the more you were going to give up your sovereignty. And so, by the time a grandchild or great grandchild came along, maybe the sovereignty is gone and they don't claim being Native anymore. Right. And so then you have on the opposite side, you have one drop of blood, and that is for African Americans. And the more African American the less, it doesn't matter how African American you are. If there's one drop, you're considered African American by law, right? This was long time ago. It's changed since, but blood quantum still exists. But both of these things were economically driven, right? And this is the thing about eugenics. This is the thing about science and race, is that there's usually economics attached, right? So the more African American you were, the more policies there were that kept you marginalized. The less Native American you were, the more you landed into the general American population and lost your rights to sovereignty, right? And so again, you're losing resources. And so both of these were just different sides of the same coin. And so you still see some of that today because there still is blood quantum, right? And you still see things like, you still see in the DNA testing, right? You see these kind of ideas that differ in terms of what makes a person, from this specific country, from that country, right? And that's determined by private corporations right now. So, there are lots of different ways that I think we could look into it. There are some folks that talk about medical genetics, and Genome Project didn't have people of color for a while. And so, someone might be able to argue that was a form of eugenics as well. I will say the Genome Project has been kind of bringing in more like phenotypes, more different types of people. And so that's really a benefit. And so I do think that fortunately today, a lot of people are trying to kind of be aware of this, and there are more voices involved and there are more policies involved, but you're right, it's still there. It's still there. And we see it in reproductive health too, right? Right now it's rearing its head in reproductive health. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioning the DNA tests, gosh, I ended up taking one. My mother-in-law was like, hey, here's a test to learn about your background. I was like, okay, cool. And I remember it being so like, oh my gosh, the answers. And I know that a lot of people, take this so much to heart, where they're like, I got my DNA test, I'm gonna go move to to see my people, and they go there like, oh, they treat me like an American. But I'm really glad that you sort of tie this together in terms of what we do with the data, and whether you spit into a cup and people try to tell you that you're one race, or whether the data is talking about trends within the workplace. I'm really glad that you were sort of able to talk about how diversity, equity, inclusion are apply to all these things. Pierette, it's been a joy to have you on the show to chat about some really difficult but important topics on CRT and eugenics. You are always welcome back on LLAG Radio. But before we head out, what are you working on these days, and where can the LLAG community find and support you?
Well, these days I am doing a lot of DEI workshops and facilitations. I am working with different educational institutions. I'm working with a lot of wellness institutions. I'm working in environmental justice, but I really pretty much work in every area, the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector as well. And you can find me on, I'm actually working on my website, so I will get back to you with that one. But you can find me on my website soon, coming, and then also you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter as well.
Awesome. Well, again, it was a pleasure having you on the show. All right, everyone, Pierette, have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.